Hi, it's Helen Tarrant.
Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Commercial Property Roadshow. Just wanted today to cover off the topic. We had a question regarding how evaluation's done in commercial property. Now, I'm not a valuer, so if you're going through your valuation process and looking for someone to look at valuing your property, we can certainly give you some contacts, and they're located in different states and different areas. We would use different valuers. Now, especially if you are buying a property in regional, we tend to suggest you use a valuer that is local to the area, that knows the area, knows the property quite well. So, for example, you're in regional Victoria, I would use someone local and smaller in the area. If you were in Metro, then I would suggest using a larger branded property valuers. So, your CBREs, your Knight Franks, your Optins, as well as your Heron White Todds. Those are really good valuers on the market, and they will help you to find the great valuations. I mean, at the moment, the market is a little bit volatile, so it's hard to work out what exactly is the right valuation. So, valuations is really, really important in your commercial property purchase. But I'll just give you a quick snapshot of how it works. So, there's two ways of valuation in commercial property. So, number one way is to look at a property whether it's tenanted or when it's vacant. So if it's a tenanted property, then the property itself becomes a property that is valued based on the rent and the yield. So we talked about the yield before. So what a yield is the property cash flow return in the commercial. So that is after all outgoings but before mortgage, and that's usually used as a benchmark in comparison to other properties in the area. So for example, if you're getting a 7% yield in Brisbane and you're thinking that's really good, then what you might find is that in this local area, in the same complex or in a hub that's next door or something within 5k radius, everything's selling around that 7% or 6.75 or 7.25. So it's usually a range, and that you're sitting within that range, and it's an acceptable range. Now, all of a sudden, if you're getting a 7.5% yield on this property, then you're sitting a higher above market, which means you're doing well. You're already building some equity into the property. Now, if you're buying that property at 6.5% and you're finding that the range is 6.75 to 7.25, you're actually buying above the market. So you're paying a little bit more for that property, and that's how you work that out. Along with that, what will also be worked out is rate per square meter in terms of outgoings as well as the rent. So if your rent for your office space or retail or warehouse is $500 a square meter, in comparison to other properties in the area, which might be $550 or $600, then your tenant is paying below market rent, or it's within that range and they're paying on market rent. Now, if you're doing $600 a square meter, but your other tenants in comparison are paying $400 a square meter, then you're finding that you're purchasing something where your tenants are paying inflated rent. Now, those are the two important things when I look at a valuation report I go over and I pay attention to, because if you are sitting under the market and under market rent, then I'm totally happy with that, because I know in a few years' time I can always adjust rent to market and the property will be easier to lease out. But if I'm above market, that's when I would go back and try to renegotiate, because I can try to negotiate the price so that I'm getting a higher yield, so it balances itself out in terms of the terms of what I'm getting rate per square meter, because I know that at some point in the future, when it comes to rent review, I'm going to have to pull back that rent, and I might be getting a lesser rent and a lesser yield, and that balances out. So the most important thing is to look at the yield you're getting and how that compares to the rest of the market around you within that 5k radius, and also how that compares your rate per square meter in terms of rentals, because you want to know that if your tenant does vacate, you can actually go out and rent out the property. The other thing to look at is at the outgoings. So there is usually a quote about outgoings. So tenant might be paying $400 or $500 net per square meter, but they might be paying $50 or $15 or $75 per square meter in terms of outgoings. Now, what outgoings are is your strata, insurance, also management fees may or may not be included, but things like council and water. So those things come out as an aggregate, as a total, and that's divided per square meter to work out what that is. So if you match that up and you can see that your tenant's paying above average, then you might be finding that, okay, so maybe your strata is a little bit high here, Maybe also your tenant might want to pay, might find that the outgoing is a bit too high. That may mean that you might have to give them a reduction in rent so that you match us up with other things and other properties in the market. So that is something to pay attention to as well. So remember, when you're looking at yield and comparing yields in terms of valuation, we're looking at the yield in comparison, what's the cap rate, so what's the general rate in the market, so what you're currently getting in your property. So if you're getting a 7 and the cap rate in the market is 6.75 to 7.25, then you're within that acceptable range. And also looking at the rents as well. So if your rent is sitting above that acceptable range in that area, so 400 to 500, and your tenant's paying 450 or 500, that's fine. But if your tenant's paying 550, then you're sitting above. And you've got to be aware that if you're sitting above, at some point that may need to be scaled back during a rent review. So that's the number one method. The number two method in valuation, and that applies to a vacant property, is to look at the rate per square meter in comparison. Now, vacant properties, because you don't have a tenant, there isn't a yield. There's a potential rent, but there's also things you need to take in consideration in terms of the potential rent, and that's the incentives you need to give to your tenant, and that's usually the incentives that's average in the market. So if it's a really hot market and that area is really in demand, you may not need to give them any incentives. You might need to give them only a month, or you might give them give them no outgoings for a month or two, or alternatively you might be able to help them with a little bit of fit out contribution. But if it's a new property on the market in a new area and the area still needs to gentrify and things still changing, or that at the moment during the current environment there is a lot of leasing going on, so you have to offer really aggressive incentives. You might need to give them 2, 3 or up to 6 months rent free, depending on the length of the lease, plus maybe incentives for fit out, plus some incentives in terms towards the outgoings to get your tenants started. So if that's the case, and there is usually an average, how many percentage of that to the rent. So if your rent is, let's say, $50,000 a year, and your leasing incentive is 10% or 20%, it means that you have to give the tenant up equivalent value of $5,000 or $10,000 in terms of rental incentives, in terms of leasing incentives, sorry. So what that means is that $5,000 or $10,000 comes as a combination. It can be a combination of rent-free, so you can give them 3 months rent-free, which could add up to $9,000, and then you might say, well, they don't need to pay outgoings during that time, and that adds up to $10,000. Or alternatively, you might say, okay, I'll give you 2 months rent-free, but I'll give you $4,000 towards a fit-out, and that might go towards carpeting, lighting, or putting a new air conditioning unit in there. See, so it all depends on what you are actually giving your tenant and what's the market rate at that time, and depending if it's a hot market or a market that is very competitive. So even in a competitive market, you might want to be offering above market incentives, which means that you want to be offering them, maybe 3 months rent free plus an extra $5,000 in terms of the fit out. So there's lots and lots of things that will affect that. So that comes in as part of the valuation in terms of how much it's going to cost you to get a tenant. Plus there is a rate per square meter, so as in terms of the purchase price. So if you're buying a property at 500,000, 50 square meters, that's $10,000 a square meter. So how does that compare to the property next door within a 5K radius, similar type of properties? So if other people are paying $12,000 one street away, then is their property better than yours in the terms of amenities and what they offer to the tenants, or is yours sitting better but just cheaper? So age of the building matters in terms of other developments in the area, your rate per square meter. So that works out as that's the main comparison point when you're looking at a vacant property, is rate per square meter in comparison to others. So if you're within that acceptable range, then that should come in on valuation. And on top of that, there's going to be comments around leasing incentives and also what's a realistic rent for that property. So that will help you to work out what would be the yield and ultimately why you would buy a vacant property. If it's for owner-occupier, you want to know that you're not buying it too high compared to what others are on the market. If it's for investment purposes, you want to know that you're buying it so that you can get a tenant in there and you're achieving above higher than market yield. Otherwise, why would you go through the exercise and risk of buying a vacant property? So that's the two-way evaluation. Of course, a valuation report is very detailed and go through many, many pages. Some of them can be 60, 70 pages. In one of the follow-up videos, I'll actually go through one and show you how it works. So you get to see what it says and the comparison as well. But also, just before I go, one more tip as well. Commercial works just like residential, and you will see that if you bought a property 5, 7, 10 years ago and you've held it for capital growth, you can get the property revalued, pull out the equity and use that as a deposit for the next property. So that works exactly the same, but normally in any commercial valuation you have to wait at least 1 year before the value will come in, or there needs to be a substantial change of circumstance, which means that your current tenant could have vacated, you got a new tenant in, you did a total refurbishment of the property, you got a new brand new lease, and you want the bank to come and revalue it as well. So watch your timing in the market, watch what you've done to the property, and there's always endless opportunities to revalue, bring the equity back up and use that to buy again for your next purchase. But in the meantime, if you've got any other questions, please post your comments below, but don't forget to subscribe, hit the bell, and I'll see you in the next video. So until next time, bye for now.